the U.S.-Israel relationship is not conditioned in any way, really on anything, but it's certainly not conditioned on success or failure of the peace process. That's the exact opposite of the relationship with the Palestinians. But Palestinians are only relevant in the context of a peace process from the standpoint of U.S. policy.
Welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm your host, Dave Reed. At Mondoweiss, we cover the movements, activists, and policymakers who affect the struggle for freedom in Palestine. In this episode, Mondoweiss founder and senior editor Phil Weiss speaks to Khaled Elgindy about the first meeting between President Joe Biden and newly installed Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Earlier this year, Bennett joined centrist politician Yair Lapid to build an unusual coalition of right-wing, centrist, and liberal political parties to topple Benjamin Netanyahu. This government marks the first time Palestinian Israeli political parties are included in a governing coalition. Bennett is a far-right political figure opposed to Palestinian statehood and ending settlement expansion, and he's focused on Iran as the greatest threat to Israeli security. Khaled Elgindy is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he directs the program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. Prior to that, he was a fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution. Elgindy was an advisor to the Palestinian leadership on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009, and he was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007 and 2008. He is the author of the book Blind Spot: America and the Palestinians, From Balfour to Trump.
Khaled, thanks for getting on this call. I want to discuss with you the Biden-Bennett summit of last week. I realize this is a little bit off your expertise in that your book and that came out a couple of years ago, Blind Spot, is about U.S.-Palestinian relations. And this is a case that we're discussing, well, obviously a big part of your book, but the U.S.-Israeli relationship. You are a scholar at the Middle East Institute, and I'm hoping to get your reaction to what happened on Friday, what the significance of that long-awaited meeting between the U.S. president and the Israeli prime minister, what the significance of that is, and particularly with respect to the Palestinian future.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Phil. It's good to be with you. Just a quick point, obviously, my focus has been on U.S.-Palestinian relations, but it's impossible, as you know, to talk about the U.S. and the Palestinians without looking at Israel. I mean, it is a relationship defined and first and foremost by it's really an outgrowth of the U.S.-Israel relationship. It's a byproduct more than it is a relationship in and of itself. So it's impossible to look at the Palestinian issue without obviously looking at Israeli politics and the U.S.-Israel bilateral relationship. As far as the meeting last Friday, I think there were no real surprises. I think it was really about the optics more than anything else. The substance of the relationship is, I think, fairly constant, even when there is a rocky relationship between the president and the prime minister of Israel. And so this was really about, as Prime Minister Bennett put it, it's about turning a new page. It's about closing that chapter of the Netanyahu era and beginning a new chapter from the standpoint of a personal relationship between a different prime minister and a different U.S. president. And I think they both went out of their way to stress the unshakable, unbreakable bonds between the two countries. We heard a lot of standard talking points in the press conference that was held in the Oval Office, and so this was really about demonstrating the strength of the relationship and putting it on new footing and turning the page on the Netanyahu era.
I agree with what you've said based on my reading of the press, that there were no surprises, and that the chief element of this is, as you described, this turning of the page. Were there small surprises to you? And related, the great pleasure of the Israel lobby organizations, the pro-Israel organizations, in the apparent good feeling between these two guys who have so much power. Is that are the pro-Israel groups right to be deriving satisfaction from this discussion?
I mean, I do think that the generally positive optics that were intended came through. I mean, that was, the goal from an Israeli or pro-Israel standpoint was to demonstrate that the closeness of the relationship is not limited to a right-wing Israeli prime minister and a right-wing American president, but that it is bipartisan in nature. You have a very right-wing Israeli prime minister and a, establishment, sort of centrist Democrat as a president. And so it's important, given where the presidential debate was, given the dissension inside the Democratic Party, particularly among the progressive wing, who are talking about conditioning aid to Israel and upholding Palestinian rights. That's created a bit of a crisis inside the Democratic Party and a lot of angst for the pro-Israel crowd at what many people see as the demise of what we used to call the bipartisan consensus on Israel. And so this was one way to demonstrate that bipartisan consensus is still very much in place. Whether it is or isn't, of course, is a different matter. It's much deeper than the meeting between two individuals. You still do have dissension inside the Democratic Party when it comes to Israel and Palestine. But as far as the optics are concerned, I think it went the way it was supposed to go as choreographed.
I noted that I believe Palestinians were mentioned only once in passing in Biden's commentary on his statement about the meeting. Can you give us a sense of how Palestinians feel or should feel about their prospect for any sort of rights in Israel and Palestine, and particularly in the occupied territories, on the basis of what happened in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak for Palestinians, but I think it's not a surprise also that the Palestinian issue was marginal in this summit between the two leaders. It's not a priority for either leadership, not for the Biden administration, and certainly not for the Bennett government. The Palestinian issue is precisely the sort of issue that can bring down this very fragile, broad coalition that Bennett and Lapid are ruling over. So both the Biden administration and the Bennett government have an interest in pushing aside the Palestinian issue. And so I don't think Palestinians will be surprised to hear that. I think especially after the crisis in May, both the violence in Jerusalem and in Gaza, that was clearly on display. That the Biden administration in particular is not really interested in even dealing with the sort of second tier issues like home demolitions and expulsions and settlements. Never mind the very dicey issues of final status like Jerusalem and sovereignty and Palestinian statehood. Those are clearly off the table. But even the more limited issues of conflict mitigation or conflict management is something that the Biden administration isn't really interested in dealing with. And I think beyond, of course, we don't know what was said privately, but I imagine it was more than what was said publicly about the Palestinians. I'm sure there was a reference to Gaza. There was probably a reference to the expulsions in Jerusalem, and trying to generally make life better for Palestinians. But beyond that, I don't think Palestinians really have much to expect from either of these two leaders.
U.S. policy is for a two-state solution. Bennett said pointedly to the New York Times ahead of this meeting, there will never be a Palestinian state. Is that going to be a source of tension going forward between these two countries under these two administrations, in your view? And also, what is the status of that two-state solution right now? Two big questions.
Yeah, I mean, on the first part of the first question, no, I don't think it's going to be a source of tension. I think if there are any potential sources of tension, it will be, related to the Palestinians. It will be on things like the expulsions and perhaps another round of fighting in Gaza that this administration will seek to avoid. And so, but those are likely to be mild and probably not on public display. There will be, concerns will most likely be conveyed privately and, rather than in the public sphere. So, but no, there isn't an ideological dispute here. It's not a source of tension. I think the Biden administration very well understands that Bennett is ideologically opposed to a two-state solution, and it's not a problem at all. I mean, they both have gone out of their way to demonstrate that the U.S.-Israel partnership and alliance is as strong as ever, and it's not going to, unlike the situation with the Palestinians, the peace process has never been, the U.S.-Israel relationship is not conditioned in any way, really on anything, but it's certainly not conditioned on success or failure of the peace process. That's the exact opposite of the relationship with the Palestinians. The Palestinians are only relevant in the context of a peace process from the standpoint of U.S. policy. So, Netanyahu was working against two states, and he also said that a two-state solution will not happen on my watch. So that's not new, and that's not going to provoke any sort of crisis. As far as, that does, I think, kind of beg the question of where things stand as far as the two-state solution is concerned. I think to a large extent, the question of whether a two-state solution is still viable is sort of a philosophical debate, really. It really just depends on what people think is theoretically possible and doable, more than it is to some, it's not connected to, necessarily to realities on the ground. If you look at realities on the ground, it's very hard to conclude that a two-state solution is still achievable. But of course, theoretically, you could have potentially at some point down the road a new Israeli government that is willing to divide Jerusalem and cede sovereignty over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians. Is that likely? I think it's highly unlikely, particularly given the context in Israeli politics, which are, notwithstanding this current coalition government that is quite broad and includes some left-wing elements. The reality is that Israeli politics are pretty much dominated by the right. The Israeli Knesset has a very, very solid right-wing majority. And for the most part, the consensus in Israeli politics about two states has collapsed. It's really only the purview of the Arab parties and the few leftist parties in the fringe. So that in and of itself sort of argues against the viability of a two-state solution. But since politics and diplomacy hate a vacuum, the United States and the international community will continue to adhere to the goal of two states until something else replaces it, even if it's no longer physically or politically achievable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to get to that question, and I don't want to keep you too long, but I want to get to that question of the discourse that may be replacing the two-state solution in a second. But I first want to ask you about words that you used earlier in this discussion, conflict management. It's a very important way, in my view, of understanding Israeli policy, and yet even people who are tuning into this podcast who know these issues well may not fully understand what conflict management means. You used it. You said this is Bennett's. This is what Bennett is doing. Can you explain what that means? And also, if you don't mind, if you care to, inject a moral framework on that, or a human rights framework, whether it's a good or bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, what I mean by conflict management is the goal of containing basically violent outbursts on both or either side, not resolving these long-standing core issues like Jerusalem and refugees and statehood, but rather trying to prevent violent outbreaks, or to mitigate them, or to sort of diminish their kind of spillover effect. For example, the roadmap of 2003 was a conflict management initiative. It was designed to, take the parties, to disengage them. Both sides had obligations as far as tamping down on violence or incitement, and there was also steps that both sides needed to take in order to get back to a political process to try to resolve the conflict. So conflict management is just this very broad term of trying to prevent violence in a systematic way. Now, it means different things to different people. So, for example, the Israeli army or security forces might decide that the way to manage conflict is through repression. If we arrest large numbers of Palestinians, if we use live ammunition against protesters, this will be enough of a disincentive for people to go home and stay quiet and keep the calm. So that's one model of conflict management, which many dictatorships use, and that is trying to maintain calm through repression. That's unlikely to work, and it really hasn't worked in any context. More often than not, because of increasing casualties, it just acts as an exacerbator of conflict. And so this is why you need, the Israeli version of conflict management, and there's probably a spectrum even on the Israeli side, should be subordinated really to third parties. This is why you bring in third parties to act as mediators, because they supposedly will insist that both sides have to meet certain obligations and take certain steps to de-escalate and to prevent violence, ideally within the framework of some other plan to bring about, or at least keep possible, a political resolution. But we don't have that happening. This administration is not even all that interested in conflict management. It's certainly not interested in conflict resolution. I think that's where the danger is, because they're inclined to defer conflict management to the Israelis and say, do whatever you got to do to keep things calm, whether it's allowing more economic activity or even security action. because we don't really have a plan. This administration doesn't have a vision for what conflict management looks like.
Thank you. That's very helpful and fascinating. Lastly, Khaled, if I could just ask you about the left-wing discourse of apartheid on this question, and merging actually with the sort of mainstream liberal discourse of a struggle for equal rights that Carnegie spoke of earlier this year. To frame it actually more in a more pointed fashion, you referred to the May conflict, and certainly an iconic image of that May conflict was when Biden met Rashida Tlaib on the tarmac of the Detroit airport. And it was a very moving moment to a lot of people because you saw a Palestinian American speaking up for human rights and the onslaught that was occurring in Gaza, these helpless civilians. She was framing that to the president of the United States, and it certainly seemed to have an effect in that there was a ceasefire within a couple of days of that, and Biden, you got the impression, was telling Netanyahu, you got to wind this down. This is really breaking up the Democratic Party support for Israel. And Rashida Tlaib came up to me at the airport. Whatever, we can imagine how that went down. But certainly Rashida Tlaib reflects this discourse that I referred to of apartheid that the left is bringing. Do you see this as a significant component of the discussion going forward? Has Biden been able to tamp it down? Where do you see that discourse going in politically in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say whether there is in fact a causal relationship between that meeting that took place between Biden and Congresswoman Tlaib, and the ceasefire a few days later. But I certainly am not privy to those kinds of meetings. But I'm not convinced that there's a direct causal relationship there.
Okay.
I think the fighting had gone on a long time. I think certainly the angst and anger really inside the progressive community was a factor in general. I can't say that particular meeting was a factor, but I'm sure it was in some way. But there was real anger with the casualties piling up, and it was just the images of apartment buildings and media offices and others getting blown up. It's not good optics for the administration, and it certainly wasn't good for the Israelis. So there was an interest in trying to wrap that up. As far as the discourse, there is a bit of a convergence. We've seen this administration adopt certain aspects of the progressive agenda, even on foreign policy. We have seen the Biden administration adopt certain aspects of the progressive agenda. For example, I mean, certainly on domestic policy, but even on foreign policy, like the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was probably generally very popular in the American public, but particularly for the progressives who've been complaining about so-called forever wars, and so. But I don't think. I don't think. I think Israel-Palestine is probably one of the areas that are. This is still run very much by the president and his inner circle. They are. I think there are certain nods that they will make to the progressives. I mean, one interesting example, I think, is it's purely rhetorical, but it is interesting in that it's different than previous administrations. This formula that the administration has adopted about equal measures of freedom, security, prosperity, and so forth for Israelis and Palestinians, this is new language. And
Interesting.
You could argue that it's a maybe a rhetorical progressive wing that is pushing a more rights-based approach, or maybe it's just sort of empty rhetoric that is intended to paper over the fact that there isn't a lot of substance to how we get to a two-state solution, or what even this phrase means. What does it mean to have equal measures of freedom and security and prosperity for Palestinians and Israelis? I mean, if nothing else, it's an acknowledgement of the unequal reality between the two sides. That one side has reasonable amounts of security and prosperity and freedom, and the other side doesn't. So it is, I think, noteworthy that it's at least aspirational or rhetorical, but nobody knows really what it means. But I think you could make the case that this is at least a nod to those who would push a more rights-based approach.
Just one last, bite of the apple here. Am I allowed to derive some kind of cynical satisfaction from the fact that these people are arguing about whether there can even be an American consulate for Palestinians in Jerusalem? I mean, that's the facts on the ground that Trump established or Biden is accepting. I mean, I need to throw that in before we end up here.
I'm not sure I follow the thrust of your question. I mean, is it? There is that debate happening. I don't know how hard this administration is going to push. We know that the Bennett government doesn't want to reopen the consulate. We also know that the Biden administration has not fully repudiated the Trump agenda on a whole set range of issues, including on settlements. We haven't seen a formal reversal of some of those policies that Trump put in place. Maybe they're going to happen. Maybe they're on the agenda, or maybe they won't. But there has not been like a full-throated repudiation of the Trump vision. And I'm not sure how hard they're going to push on things like the consulate in Jerusalem.
Thank you. I appreciate that PS, and that's a good insight. Again, thanks so much for participating, and we'll get this up in the next few hours or day.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. Good luck.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to our show, a production of Mondoweiss.net. The music is from Sound of Picture. Visit our site to sign up for free daily and weekly newsletters on Palestine, Israel, and related U.S. politics. If you're enjoying our podcast, please consider becoming a donor by visiting Mondoweiss.net/donate. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication, and every donation of any amount helps sustain our work. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find our show.